There we go. So, welcome everybody. I am Gretchen Sable. I'm Communications Director for League of Women Voters Upper Mississippi River Region. And our speaker today is Carrie Jennings. Carrie is the Policy and Research and Policy Director for the Freshwater Society. Freshwater is an organization based here in Minnesota, but they serve the nation or the Midwest, Carrie?
Great Lakes region.
Great Lakes region. Okay. Carrie has a doctorate from the University of Minnesota, and she's worked in Minnesota for a long time. We have crossed paths a few times in our different roles, even now as we're retired people doing other retired people things. Maybe you're still working people. I'm a retired person doing retired person things. So anyhow, I'm really glad that Carrie can be with us today. She just was testifying at the legislature yesterday about the need for more information about groundwater availability, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is how groundwater should be a factor in making a lot of decisions and how we could have better information for that and better management structures for groundwater. So, Carrie, is there anything else you want me to say about you?
That sounds good.
Okay, take it away.
Okay, we practiced. This should work. And view, hold on, gotta make it a full screen. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I know that the topic is this good? Can you see my screen and can you hear me okay? I lost sound from everybody.
Looks good and sounds good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I thought I'd start with a nice little picture of some watercress so we can think about some of the things that groundwater supports and why we need to think about where large water users will be best placed so that we can support healthy ecosystems and also other groundwater users. Um, this is work that well, let me put this into perspective for you. So what I hope you come away with is putting this proposed water use, whether it's for data centers or some other large water users, in terms of what the groundwater distribution is across the nation, where groundwater is currently used and what it's used for, where there is already either scarcity or abundance, where there are existing priorities for groundwater in statute, and where that's not statutorily defined, and the existing groundwater policy, and then alternatives to using groundwater for some of these large water users. And this is work that we have done across this region. This is called EPA Region 5. However, I think that I know we have potentially people on the call from Iowa and Missouri, and this is relevant to you too. This is just, our EPA region. And we have been working for a little over 3 years now to describe the existing system of groundwater governance in this region surrounding the Great Lakes. And this is because there's existing international agreements around the Great Lakes as in the form of the International Treaty. And the funder that we've been working with wanted us to consider whether or not groundwater agreements would be possible. So we're looking at the existing system and then how adequate it is to support sustainable use of groundwater. We had a phase one report, which we conducted interviews during COVID online with the 6 states and the 35 tribal nations within this region to understand how they produce knowledge about groundwater, what their current institutional structure was governing groundwater, different approaches, and then challenges they were facing. And this was done with a partnership of people that met for the first time after the project was over, including groups from Ohio, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, funded by the Joyce Foundation. And this was Taryn Mayer's kind of PhD project. He was at the Humphrey School at the time. And now in the second phase of work, we decided to focus in on certain areas where there was clear transboundary governance issues. And that is aquifers shared across political jurisdictions down in this corner of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, around the Chicago metropolitan area, the suburbs of Chicago, north central Wisconsin, and then you can't really see this one here in Scott County, Shakopee, Midwalk, and Sioux community in Scott County. What the purple is the ceded territory. I'll say a little bit more about that, but those treaties are still in play, and that gives the governments of those tribal nations more authority over water, not just on reservation, but in the ceded territory as well. And the little kind of flame or water droplet locations approximate the 35 tribal nations within this region. So we want to understand how we can all come together about our shared groundwater use. And so we hosted these specific conversations where we could. We held them at tribal centers, casinos or something, just to kind of flip the script a little bit and make tribal governments more comfortable with attending. And these are some pictures from our Mishindo, cleverly named Michigan and Indiana, Ohio aquifer. That is the sole source potentially for the city of Bryan. At least they petitioned the EPA for sole source designation. Um, the data center water use issue did not come up during these conversations because they concluded last fall. And it feels like data center water use has just sprung into everybody's, center view just this legislative session. And this is when we became aware of the large water use that, 1 megawatt data center can use up to the daily water consumption of 300,000 people. And it's really just for evaporative cooling. And that means a medium-sized data center is going to be equivalent to 3 hospitals or 18-hole golf course, 2 18-hole golf courses. You'll see these numbers vary quite a bit, and that's because the actual technology to cool data centers with water is kind of a black box. The engineering firms don't really even understand what's going on in there. They're just told by the companies that they have a proprietary design that requires a certain amount of water. So it'll vary quite a bit, but I want you to be aware that, these ChatGPT and AI searches that we do are consuming water. 2 cups of water for 10 to 50 responses, or a 100-word ChatGPT email would be like a water bottle's worth of water. So if we keep growing in this way, the AI demand for water, if they keep cooling with groundwater, is going to be I've heard people say an existential threat on groundwater. And the other large water users that we have to consider in the same equation include various forms of agriculture. The textile industry is a big water user. Biofuels, we all remember the ethanol boom and the pressure that put on water in rural Minnesota. Granite Falls, today Granite Falls well, they had problem with water availability, but we'll see more water use with sustainable aviation fuel, green hydrogen. And then of course there's the beverage industry, including just straight up water bottling, biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, electric power, forest products, high-tech metals, and mining. So I want you to think about all of these when we talk about large water users, because you might want to favor some of those over others, or see some of those as more essential services or users of groundwater. So let's just make sure we start with a fundamental common understanding of what groundwater is. Um, you see it every day because it is expressed in the water levels in our perpetual lakes and rivers. That is the groundwater supplying that constant amount of water to those water bodies. The lakes aren't just bowls that fill up with rain, but they are the water table where it's cropping out. And the water then that saturates the layers that have pore spaces is groundwater. And in this cartoon, they show it as kind of saturating everything from the water table on down, but we know there are some layers that don't really host very much groundwater. That would be like really tightly packed rocks like shale, or crystalline rocks like granite. And groundwater always began as precipitation or glacial meltwater, and it's stored in these pore spaces of sediment and rock. And it's really the connections of those pores that impacts how available the water is. It's rare to have large open caverns. I think people think of underground rivers and lakes, and that's really not common, especially in our region. However, Missouri, Iowa, southeast Minnesota does have cave systems with karst and some large openings, but they're not usually water filled. They have some water in them, and it moves kind of quickly. The reason groundwater is looked at for cooling is because it is insulated from our seasonal temperature changes. The ground freezes up here every year, but down below the depth of frost, it's kind of a constant temperature. So if you could get down to like 6 feet, you're going to see the average annual temperature of the planet kind of represented. And so this chart on the right might look like your garden chart, but that is the mean temperature of groundwater. So we're looking at, sorry, it's in Celsius, but I know that I use a geothermal system for my home, and my groundwater is about 46 degrees here. And then that's the first aquifer, and maybe deeper ones, but usually it's the first aquifer is the one that's most likely connected to surface water features, your lakes, perennial streams, wetlands, springs. And I'm showing you a picture of a stream here that's getting that it's winter, but that stream is flowing because you can tell groundwater is coming into it. That groundwater might be producing steam in that stream and supporting something like watercress. But in other places, you can have these shaly confining layers, and so your groundwater might be under pressure and confined by different rock layers, not allowing it to be expressed at the surface unless you penetrate it with a well, and then you might have a flowing well or an artesian well. And then this water might be as old as the last rainfall, or it could be the age of the glacial melt, 10,000 years. So the range of age is important to understand because that tells you how sustainable the current use of the groundwater is. And I just want to show you a diagram of a well. I'm not sure how many of you are well users, but a well is a pipe that's cased down to the interval that you're interested in, and then you have a screened interval at the very bottom, and then you usually drop a pump on a cable or another pipe, submersible pump that's well below the level that the water rises to in the well, so that when there's fluctuation from drawing down the water, you don't have it drawing air. This is the case of, this is showing a well going into a confined aquifer here because there's that layer of clay over it. And it's possible that your state has specifications on how these wells are constructed and that you require a licensed person to do this. Sometimes records are required to be submitted for how this well was constructed, but the maintenance and testing of water in a private well is up to the private well owner currently. And then usually you want to think about wells, if they're not being used, as possible entry points. It's like having a puncture in your skin. It might be a place where contamination can enter the aquifer. So there might be some regulation in your state about sealing it when it's done. That would mean filling it with concrete. What usually happens, the first sign that there is a problem with a large water user is when you start to draw hard on that well, start to pump hard, it just pulls down the surface of the water table in the area of that well. And if you could see this in 3 dimensions, it would make more sense why it's called a cone, because it is cone shaped. And the problem with large water users, they might stop pumping and that cone of depression might rebound a little bit. But if you have a shallower well within that cone of depression, then you're going to experience your well will be sucking air. So that's called well interference. So these are the first concerns of large water users in an area that, there might be a regional lowering of that water table, but the interference with existing wells is the first sign of a problem. So if and when a large water user is coming into your area as a state or as a municipality, these are questions I put down as maybe things that should be asked. What is your current distribution of usable groundwater? Who's already using it? How much are they using? Where is scarcity concern? What are your societal priorities for using groundwater, and are there alternatives? So I'm going to go through these one by one, and I hope I don't run out of time here. So I want to just show you my favorite map, which is a jigsaw puzzle from the USGS too, that shows you kind of why groundwater is distributed the way it is. It's really according to the geology. So the red and orange units, no chance really of usable groundwater. And it's the purple and blue layers on this map that host available fluids. And I say fluids because some of the pore spaces in these rocks actually host petroleum products. So you can rule out the boundary waters and north in Minnesota and most of Canada, or at least eastern Canada. And then if you look, the green areas are tight shales, clays that are compressed. They're not going to host usable groundwater. As you get to the west, there's just not going to be enough precipitation to recharge aquifers. And so you're really looking at this region. And so I think this is appropriate for you as a league to be considering this group of League of Women Voters chapters. It gets complicated in the Appalachians. You can see there's some fold and thrust belt complications. We know Virginia is a large data center location, so it is possible. In that same area, though, that bedrock is not usually expressed at the surface and it's buried by glacial sediment. I'm showing you just the footprint of the last iteration of an ice sheet, one of many that covered this area in the last 2.5 or 2.5 million years. So really the ice got up to the Missouri River and down to the Ohio River. So you have had glacial material at covering your rocks unless you're in a tiny sliver of Wisconsin. That means that depending on how thick that is, it might not be affordable to drill into the bedrock to find water. So these blue shades of green and blue show how thick in meters the sediment gets. So in Michigan and parts of western Minnesota, northwestern Minnesota, you're probably not going to drill through, 600 feet of glacial sediment to find bedrock. And in fact, if you look on the map on the right, it's only the colored areas that have the kind of rock layers that host water. So really, if you're dealing with one of these areas that's largely white, you're going to be out of luck as far as bedrock aquifers, and you're going to have to be looking for some kind of smaller sand and gravel body that would host water in the glacial sediment section. And you can see that in some of these areas it gets quite thin. So down in southern Indiana and southeastern Ohio, there might not be that grade of water availability. This is from northwestern Ohio, and it shows you that the glacial section is clayey and doesn't host water, but it's bearing this bedrock that is limestone that will host water along these vertical breaks or the joints in the rock, and then the horizontal bedding planes in the rock. And then when those enlarge, that's how you get caverns. But the glacial sediment aquifers, think of something as large as the Mississippi River maybe that somehow gets buried, or the Anoka sand plain for those in Minnesota that somehow gets buried. That's me standing in a gravel pit in northern Minnesota with a fairly large glacial aquifer behind me. But it's not on my right, your left. That's bedrock. There is a sand body there, and so if you are lucky to have a house or some water user on top of that sand body, you might have a well that will produce available water. So you can tell this is a geologic exercise. I've engaged in that for 24 years with our geological survey, and that's usually where this knowledge is generated at the state geological survey level. And then you might have a separate organization that's characterizing the aquifers. Here in Minnesota, we do mapping with a university-based geological survey. We characterize the aquifers at our Department of Natural Resources and monitor them there. But in other states, there's a different structure. This is something that it's just homegrown. It's different in every region. And some states like Michigan don't really have a very large geological survey, and they do a lot of coordination with the United States Geological Survey. The funding also for these organizations varies quite a bit. That controls the knowledge production. Illinois gets a lot of funding, but a lot of federal funding, but is not producing consistent mapping across their state. And Michigan has had very little funding over the years, and it explains their lack of understanding of their very thick glacial section. Minnesota's lucky in having 30 years of sustainable funding from two different sources, and so we're kind of plugging away with really solid understanding of what's going on. For the rest of you in this area that I don't have super detailed information about your surveys, but I know the Iowa survey recently returned to the university, and it's in the College of Engineering. It had been in your DNR for a while, and it went back. Where it is placed makes a difference in their academic freedom and what they're able to do and how public facing they are. Missouri has, I don't know much about your geological survey, but these dots are proportional to the staffing levels, and you can find this information on the Association of State Geologists webpage. And then the tribal nations also potentially are producing knowledge. However, their governments they're typically tasked with the same kind of things, but they are much smaller and much fewer staff members, and their funding has been on the downswing for a while. But for example, a DNR at in Minnesota might be several hundred people, and a DNR for like Mille Lacs might be 20. And this is even though treaties are the law of the land. And so I want to just expand a little bit on this authority of tribes over these treaty territories. I'm going to back up to the treaty territories, and there would be more up here in northwestern Minnesota. The EPA in May last year gave tribes the right to water quality protection standards that protect water quality in those green areas, the ceded territory, in support of the rights that they were guaranteed at at the time of treaty signing. So that would be rights to hunt, fish, gather, travel even. So if the state standards for surface water quality that might include groundwater and connection don't support treaty reserved rights, the tribes can request stricter standards. And these treaties were in place prior to the states being an entity, and they are with the federal government. But in all cases, with all governments, there needs to be a source of information to understand your groundwater. And the fundamental information it's everywhere, but it's fairly low quality, is just the report of how the well was drilled. And I referred to that when I showed you that construction the diagram of the well construction. In Minnesota, a licensed water well driller is required to submit a well log describing the layers that they have drilled through in the best way they can. Usually they're not super geologic terms. And then these, because the distribution is so great, provide a database of what the layers are underground. And they might also tell you about the aquifer depth, what that water level is, something about the chemistry. And then usually these get into the hands of your geological survey and they interpret the results. There's some other states in the region that are using some really cool, more modern ways of understanding geology and the water-bearing layers. And these are airborne electromagnetic surveys. These aren't super popular everywhere, especially in tribal areas where a helicopter dangles something from the air and senses the electromagnetic ability of the the conductors that are water-bearing layers underground to conduct electromagnetic fields. But however, it is a really interesting way to gather data quickly, kind of expensively, but this is state of the art. And looking at these differences in resistivity, you can also find metallic deposits this way. But it's expensive, it's controversial, and it really requires some advanced, adequate consultation. This technique is perfected in Denmark, which has very similar geology to Wisconsin. And USGS and Nebraska have used it in our region. So that's how we understand what the distribution of usable groundwater is, basically well logs and maybe something fancier, and then geologists interpreting those results. So who's using it and how much? Well, here's a well distribution map, and you can see that that jigsaw puzzle map I showed you at the beginning is accurate in that the wells just really cut off as you go north into Canada, because those crystalline rocks, the granites and greenstones, just don't host available water. But then the rocks in that blue-green area do, and the glacial sediment do. So this is well distribution and purpose. Sometimes you have to go really deep for some of your water. You can see a very deep zone here on the Mississippi-Wisconsin border. But for the most part, you can usually find usable groundwater within the top 300 feet. We use groundwater for a variety of things. Sadly, the most groundwater is used for flushing toilets. This is domestic use inside the home. If you turn off your faucet when you're brushing your teeth, you're saving a little, but not as much as if you don't flush the toilet. And, we lose some to leaks and so on. We did look at the groundwater uses across the region. So if you look beyond domestic use, so that would be this blue public water supply is the domestic use. We see irrigation varies across the region, and that mostly has to do with how much sand is at the surface in the agricultural areas, because that usually needs to be irrigated. And then industrial uses varies based on kind of how industrial the state is. Some states are using quite a bit for power production. We don't really believe Illinois' numbers here, by the way, this drop. They have, their records are not very well organized, and we struggled to get them to answer the questions that we posed to them. But it's possible that they use less groundwater in the Chicago area, because years ago, when Lake Michigan was the source for the drinking water for the city of Chicago, and the rivers discharging into the lake were so polluted that they were affecting water quality for the city. This is, late 1800s. The city got permission to reverse the flow of those rivers, and they got permission to take enough of the flow of Lake Michigan to kind of flush those rivers down to the Des Plaines River. And this is it's kind of almost like a treaty. It's still a judicial decision. It can be reversed at any point. States have challenged it over the years, but what this does is it has allowed Chicago to take a certain amount of Lake Michigan water to not only flush the Des Plaines River, but potentially feed its suburbs. And so it's possible that as their suburbs grow away from the lake and experience groundwater pressures, they might be using more Lake Michigan water. Let me just show you one more slide about this, because I feel like Chicago is a good case study. It's kind of the elephant in the room. What happens to a major metropolitan area if they continue to use groundwater? And here you're seeing what's the cone of depression, basically the depression in the surface of the water in it's over 1,000 feet deep in some of these areas in the western suburbs. So Chicago's right here on the lake, and their suburbs initially were using only groundwater until they completely desaturated some of their water-bearing sands. This map shows you just where irrigation is expanding in the region. We are seeing an expansion of irrigation into these sandy areas, so the central sand plains of Minnesota and Wisconsin. There's a very sandy area here around the Indiana and Michigan dunes around Lake Michigan. Irrigation along the Illinois border and these rivers that come big sandy wide river valleys where they do a lot of agriculture, like Illinois is the pumpkin capital of the country. Didn't know that. And then Northwest Indiana. And we're seeing expansions of irrigation with crop genetics. And I just think of these irrigated areas as former glacial sand plains like this that are at the surface. And when you get sand at the surface, you end up with center pivot irrigation. And this is a map of Dakota County where I live. And each of these little blue circles is a place where there's basically a lawn sprinkler, but it's an irrigator for an agricultural area, and they spin around and make those circles. So maybe I should just point out, this is an interesting county that's a case in point because it's this gray part is urbanized, and then we have this large irrigated area. And then in this kind of agricultural cropland area that's not irrigated, we have a lot of small towns that have groundwater as their drinking water supply. And it's actually these small towns that are being approached for the data centers in Minnesota. 10 of the 11 proposed data centers are in this county. The data centers are going directly to the city councils and asking for a portion of their municipal water supply for their groundwater use. And this bypasses the scrutiny of our state agency, the DNR, that would normally do the review of the permit. The requests actually would increase the groundwater use 23% in Dakota County, according to the numbers I was given. So where is scarcity a concern, or where might there be extra capacity? Well, you really have to think about your aquifers as a checking account. And so how much is coming in, how much is going out, and hope that somebody's tracking both of those things, and has been for a long time, because it's a balance over decades that you have to be thinking about, and maybe centuries. So the potential recharge is, well, starting with the glacier that sat there and melted. That's when most of our aquifers were recharged in this region. And then it now we have a little bit of paycheck money going in with precipitation. And it's not just the precipitation, you have to think about it actually soaking in, not being used by plants and sent back to the atmosphere, not falling on frozen ground and running off, which is still happening here. It's mostly, my ground's still frozen at my house. But how much of it's actually getting in and sitting at the surface so that it can soak in. And this shows you kind of the soil water balance for the glacial material, and it gets much drier, as we know, to the west. And then hopefully somebody like your DNR is tracking how much water's coming out. this cartoon figure actually has a lot behind it. This is the groundwater province map of Minnesota, where they're trying to show us in a rank system, 1, 2, 3 to 6, 5, 6, the quantity of available water and our understanding of it. So our understanding of available water is highest in the metro area where there's a high density of wells, and we also have available water. And we know less in the southeast where there's fewer wells, but it still has the kind of rocks that host water. But then when you go out into regions 4 and 5, there's either some scarcity or not. There's no bedrock aquifers out here. And then in 6, it's the crystalline rock. So when we think about the checking account balance in, we have to think about, okay, so is precipitation going to change on us, or are we changing something else? And yes is the answer. The percent changes in total precipitation by mid-century based on this climate projection, not huge, although it gets worse to the west, and it's the summer is where we should be concerned about, how much less are we getting in the summer, because that's when recharge is happening and we're irrigating most likely. And then how many hot days are we going to have? Because that controls how much irrigation you're going to have. In a really hot, dry, windy summer, you're going to be irrigating more so that the crop is less stressed. So you have to be thinking about projected use based on these high temperature days. So increasing temperature, increasing the duration of the frost-free season, that's an important metric as well. And then changes in precipitation and precipitation style. Heavy events are going to recharge less than a soaking rain over many hours. They're all things that go into this equation. And then that's the and maybe potential use, but is anyone tracking the total withdrawals? Is anyone adding all these up and thinking about how much available water there is? And the answer is really not very carefully, at least not everywhere. We've compared the regulations across these states. Not every state has a good definition of what a high capacity well is. Not every state is identifying areas that might have some problems. Not every state is considering the cumulative impacts of withdrawal on ecosystems or recognizes the connection of surface water and groundwater or considers the water use of other states. So this is, again, homegrown governance. It grew up in the area of the state, usually in response to drought. And there's even a real difference in are the states really using the wells that are drilled to extract information? In Illinois, there's a registration system, but not a permitting system. So you notify somebody that you're drilling a well, but they might not require you to put it in a special location with a special construction, submit your results, and have constraints on how it's constructed, or require you to seal it when you're done, or differentiate between the different kinds of wells. Not all wells are for drinking. Some are exploration wells, some are to put water back in the ground. So we see variability in that across the state. Most of the states have some network of observation wells, and these are just basic pipes in the ground to monitor the water level over time in the same way you would gauge a river. And these are usually cooperatively hosted with the United States Geological Survey, but you can see that the monitoring wells are focused in those places where there's a lot of people and a lot of other use. And these darker, the purples scale to how much water is being withdrawn in those counties. And if you look at a county in the middle of Illinois, middle of Ohio, middle of Wisconsin, well, maybe Wisconsin's not a good case, but those aren't population centers necessarily. Those are irrigation centers. And so you might just be having a few more monitoring wells in that area of heavy use, just to keep track of how things are changing. So this helps us understand where scarcity might be a concern. The societal priorities for using groundwater, I think that's where most of the states aren't doing very well. They haven't really asked the people living within their boundaries what their priorities are. I think maybe we can say within that joint commission, that international treaty of the Great Lakes, that people came together around the importance of surface water features of the Great Lakes, and there's an international treaty protecting them and protecting the export of that water from the Great Lakes watersheds, and you can see the watershed boundary there. But those states that participated in this don't share such an agreement for the groundwater that might be supporting those lakes or the water in the rest of their states. And that's really where this project the Joyce Foundation funded came in is, let's talk to those states about their priorities for groundwater use and think about protecting the groundwater as well for the region instead of having it exported by pipeline or train car or virtually through products that are high water users. And that's because a lot of our region relies on groundwater for drinking water. And you can see that Minnesota and Indiana are quite high, and Wisconsin. Um, so the state agencies that have this kind of management authority over groundwater also vary. They might be the same people producing some of the knowledge. In Wisconsin, it's pretty unified. The Wisconsin DNR does the knowledge production along with their geological survey and manages the water. But I want to make sure you understand those are two different things, the knowledge production and the management of that resource. And then sometimes it's maybe the state version of the EPA that is managing water. In Illinois, there's that special case because of the Great Lakes diversion and the Army Corps of Engineers comes into play. So some people say Minnesota is blessed or cursed with this very fragmented system of water governance. Other states have many fewer agencies that are working on this. But at least in Minnesota, we have a very clear statutory priority of use that says domestic water supply and power production with approved contingency plans has the highest use. So in a period of scarcity, you would prioritize that water use over all others. And then small water users are in the next category. Agricultural irrigation and processing is the third priority of use. Power production without approved contingency plans is the fourth priority of use. Other small water users or other users in excess of 10,000 gallons per day is where data centers and these other large water users would fall. So any industrial use that is greater than 10,000 gallons per day is fifth priority. That means all these other needs need to be preserved first, and then non-essential uses of water, which actually some might argue data centers fall into that case, but certainly the fifth priority. So when we were working on this, what are the essential components of groundwater governance in a region? You really need to have that robust groundwater science. And then you need to have that groundwater management that's usually done through a permitting process of some sort. These are supported by the legal instruments that you have in your Constitution and in your, statutory language. But this piece that was missing in most of the areas was the stakeholder participation, making sure you understand what the people in your region actually want to have as their governance. And those are all the ingredients for groundwater governance. So the recommendations from our first report were that we really needed to see groundwater sustainability elevated in regional planning discussions. Usually you talk about roads and electricity, and groundwater is just assumed to be there. For the managers of groundwater, they need to have some really specific and actionable and realistic time delimited goals. They sit at a desk and decide daily whether or not a certain use is a conflict or not. And it can't be a lofty goal. It has to be, they have to be able to make that decision. And we know that groundwater governance should be inclusive, and it's best managed at the shared aquifer level. And so to understand what that aquifer is, we need to have that knowledge to define those management boundaries. And they might cross political jurisdictions, and that's where those hard conversations have to happen. In some of these high water users that are being proposed for the region, there are alternatives to using groundwater. Cooling with groundwater was outlawed in Minnesota decades ago. And the pump and dump, at least way of cooling, bringing cold groundwater into a building, running it through some kind of an air handler, and then air conditioning your building with that 47-degree water, not allowed in Minnesota. I don't think it's disallowed in the other states. What the data centers say they're doing is pumping up groundwater and cycling it a few times, maybe treating it when it starts to get concentrated minerals in it, and eventually discharging it. So, there's questions about whether or not they're violating this pump and dump kind of statutory language. But it's possible to bring that to have a closed loop system. So here on the right, where you have this blue and this red line going down, here's a surface structure of some sort, and the pipes going down in are actually closed loops. My system, I'm going to describe my house system. I have loops of that are filled with propylene glycol, which is basically a coolant, the same kind of coolant that's in your car radiator. And that goes down into the ground in a closed system. It doesn't leak out into the ground. It acquires the temperature of the groundwater because it's down there long enough. You bring that closed loop of propylene glycol up into your structure, and it goes through the air handler, and you get the cooling benefit of the groundwater without consuming groundwater. This uses a little more electric, but it is non-consumptive of groundwater. So we think that circular water solutions like closed loop geothermal and just the other kind of things that you do with recycling water, harvesting rainwater, and then maybe recharging groundwater at the end, those are the things we need to be thinking about when large water users come into our communities. The problem with making this happen is that it's an option for the data centers and other large water users currently. They're not mandated to do it. They're very much in a hurry. They're competitive with one another. They have these proprietary technologies. They don't want to share about what they're doing within their plants, and so they might not be willing to slow down and work with a local municipality to devise a system that uses the waste heat or perhaps in a regional heating system in a downtown. They're just kind of go, go, go. What's the cheapest, fastest, and least permit um, hesitance that we can do? But we know there's other ways to move heat just by designing buildings in an optimal way with natural ventilation, cool roofs, fans, cooling towers. It just doesn't make sense to use groundwater just to move heat. And the best example I can think of for Wisconsin-sized country with similar geology is Denmark again for water circularity. And they have a wonderful newsletter if you want to sign up for it. It's called State of Green. Their consultants are available globally, and they encourage visits to come and see what they do in Denmark. And in fact, our Metropolitan Council has recently visited at least once to see what kind of things can be done in Greenland. I just want to summarize a few more of these conversations with data centers that we've had. It's actually not with the data centers themselves, but it's with the engineering firms that are designing them. That, power and water security are their biggest issues and risks to siting their facilities. They might have a goal to be water neutral, but they usually don't think of what the groundwater and the water as a part of the accounting system for some reason. They need to have real high purity water because it does scale over time, like water boiling in a teapot. It comes out hot and sometimes concentrated, and so when it's discharged, it might need to have time to cool down or be treated before it can be discharged to surface water or infiltrate the ground. Most of these data centers, their first option would be to try to have this wastewater go through a city's wastewater treatment plant, but it's an overwhelming volume of water for those small towns. So they're using this for direct evaporative cooling. They can use air cooling, but they can't switch between one or the other. And our state legislation and tax incentives are working because that's what's driving these data centers to come here. But we don't have current statewide planning on water availability, power availability, and water reuse options. So I'm wrapping up, Gretchen. I see you came online. So I just want to show you this population density map and have you think about where these large population centers are. I see them all on Great Lakes or Great Rivers. And if we want to think about putting in other cities, which is the size of these water users, you have to have caution as you move away from a surface water source, especially in the urban fringe where there's a mix of private and municipal wells. So you're going to have that cone of interference and cone of depression interference problem. You can't see any large water users in these glacial sediment only areas. That's because they're not adequate. And then areas with seasonal water scarcity, like irrigated sand plains, are going to be problematic. We can expect more of these large water users to come to the Midwest, so we need to be better about getting our data in a timely way, engage with our other governments in the jurisdiction and stakeholders, and use these results to guide regional policy and planning ahead of the data centers landing here, and then require circular water design. I'll just say that there's a lot of legislation in play right now at the Capitol. This was testifying on the Water Availability Atlas last week, but there's other things that are being considered in Minnesota, at least, all in response to this current pressure. And finally, I'm going to skip that one since I'm running out of time. I told Gretchen I would end on this. Since AI is such a big consumer of water, you can go to a different kind of search engine if you want. I know that some of them are just starting out assuming you want to do an AI search, but DuckDuckGo is one that is not only a private search engine, it also doesn't force AI on you. So, and it's an adequate search engine. I'm kind of liking it. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Carrie. We have some questions that came in the chat. I started smiling when you showed that water witcher. My grandfather taught me how to witch water, so I do have a skill there. So, our questions, let's see here. Oh, looked in the wrong place. First one was, how do you determine the age of water? You were talking about the age of water, and everybody's like, well, how do you do that? So, you want to hit that
Yeah.
one?
Well, the sad way to do it is to look for recent contaminants. And so if it's got salt or nitrate or PFAS, then you know it's young water, you know. So yeah, you can do it that way. You can also, there's carbon dissolved in the water, and so you can do radioactive carbon dating, and that's a natural radioactive isotope. So you can certainly get back to the radioactive carbon point of about 20,000 years. So those are good end members. But there's a talk this week actually at the University of Minnesota, the Darcy lecturer who's going to talk about age of groundwater. You can also look at the isotopic composition of the oxygen and hydrogen, and if it looks more like glacial meltwater than rain, then it's probably the age of the glaciation.
So, another question was, how does ag and tiling impact affect recharge?
We don't know, but it seems there's two ways to think about it. Basically, what a tiling has done is lower the water table from maybe the surface down to the depth of the tile, because these are perforated pipes that are underground, and they will never let the water table rise above them because water comes up to the perforated pipe, soaks in, and then goes out to the ditch. So you are missing that 4 feet of saturated material above it, and that would be pressure driving water in. But you're also not letting water sit there on the surface. And I think we don't know how to measure that change in recharge. We don't know, yeah, we don't know how to look at the existing groundwater well network out there and say how much of that is due to tile drainage shunting off this water. So still out for determination.
The Minnesota Groundwater Association did a paper on that,
Yeah.
so we have looked at the issue a few times and still are needing more data.
Yeah, I mean tile drainage is kind of problematic for other reasons. It also when it leaches a lot of contaminants into surface water.
So other questions here. Please put questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry that you don't have chat available to you if you're a participant out there, so use the Q&A. Here's another kind of a question. Do you have any thoughts on how we'll be able to monitor climate and some of these other things as there's federal cuts? It was NOAA was specifically mentioned, but I suspect USGS will also be feeling the tap here. So do you have any
Yeah, I
thoughts
know.
on
It's problematic. No, it's a problem. And the
that? It is a
universities are
problem.
taking hits too. So, yeah, their NSF supported projects. Yeah, everyone's quite depressed about it. Don't have a good answer there.
Is there other questions out there?
Someone's got their hand raised. Dorothy.
I gotta find her.
She,
Can you do anything with Dorothy? Can
I
you?
don't know if I can
Oh,
unmute her. Let's see. No, I don't know how to. Dorothy, I think you're gonna have to write it. Unless you can, I don't know how to call on somebody.
I might be able to here. I will say that after this is done, we will have Dorothy, who?
Skye, Skye.
Yeah, Dorothy. There's a question about, did you address the question about how do agricultural tiling
I
affect?
tried to, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't really have a good
Yeah,
handle on that, but it seems logical that it would have a role because it's changing the runoff ratio for the land. So there's three things that affect water, precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. If you change any one of those, you change how much is available to soak in.
Dorothy, I put you so you can ask your question directly. Do you want to?
Thank you. I saw that I'm unmuted, and I just wanted to know when, where, and how this recording will be available. I saw that was going to be recorded, and unfortunately, I was simultaneously on this meeting and the meeting of the League of Women Voters Legislative Committee, so I couldn't pay attention to both. But I want to capture every detail that was presented here because uh, it's what I was able to pay attention to. It is of great importance.
Yeah, so Dorothy, I can answer that question. This is Gretchen. I have recorded this and I will send a link to the recording to everyone that signed up for this video. So that'll go out to 65 people. And then I will also put it in our newsletter and it's posted on our YouTube channel. And Mary Ellen's going to share some other information about things. Mary Ellen Miller.
Perfect, thank you.
Mary Ellen Miller is the chair of League of Women Voters Upper Mississippi River Region. She's down in Iowa. And she's going to talk to us a little bit.
Can I just address a couple more of the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A?
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, what case studies do we already have about existing data centers? I think in Minnesota, no case studies. The case studies I've seen are in Virginia, which is just kind of a data center mecca. The data centers in Minnesota that are existing aren't these hyperscale data centers, so we don't understand what the proposed use is going to do. But the range of groundwater use projected for Dakota County, as I mentioned before, from numbers I've given by Dakota County, would increase the groundwater use for the county by 23%, which is significant, I would say. And you have to think about that in terms of what would you rather do with that 23% of groundwater increase? Are you limiting your growth potential? And someone else asked, oh, same person, are there alternative methods of cooling that might supplant the need for groundwater? And the answer is yes, the air cooling, but also and closed loop geothermal. But we also were made aware of a mine in Norway called the Lefdal mine. You good Norwegians can spell that. It's an old olivine mine at the head of a fjord, and it's a cold, open chamber in the rock with groundwater leaking into it. And it's a secure data center location in Norway where they're just taking advantage of those cold temperatures underground. And so we reached out to Commissioner Rukavina of the Iron Range Resource and Recovery Board and talked to the people up there with Minnesota Power about, hey, any spaces you have up in the range where you could put data centers underground where there's groundwater's an issue leaking in. And in addition to underground chambers, they have that 100-mile long series of mine pit lakes, very deep, cold lakes. Lake Superior is another very deep, cold lake where surface water, which is more sustainable than groundwater, could be used potentially to cool data centers, and you can actually track it better. So my purpose in introducing the bill for water availability in Minnesota was to combine the groundwater and surface water availability so that we can show industries that want water that they could be more securely located in other regions and off of groundwater. Because I really feel because of these age constraints of groundwater and what we saw in the city population centers across the Midwest, you better save it for your people. And even then, it's going to be problematic. And Chicago, Kane County, west of Chicago, is the good case in point where the 1,000-foot cone of depression extends up to Wisconsin. You just can't grow a metropolitan area on groundwater.
All right. Were there more questions or did we hit them all?
I see a couple more. Gary Dukes, how much does irrigation in Dakota County affect evaporation of groundwater, pollution of groundwater? Definitely a lot evaporates unless it's a drip. I know there's a lot of irrigated nursery crops, and they tend to put drip lines underneath, layers, so it's not just spraying into the air. And absolutely, it drives nitrate contamination deeper into the ground because the way the well code is you're required to build your well down into the deep bedrock aquifer. And then as the water's coming up, you insert the nitrate and maybe chemicals into it when you irrigate, and that pollutes the surface aquifer with nitrates. And the groundwater use in the deep aquifer drives the surface water deeper. And so we're increasingly nitrifying our deep aquifers in Dakota County. Dakota County Environmental has very good imagery of this, showing that it's happening over time. Same question for data centers.
Okay, so we are getting down to the end here, and I will
Yep.
throw it up to Mary Ellen now. Thank you very much, Carrie.
Yep. Mhm.
Like I said, we will get this out to people. I've always enjoyed Carrie's lectures. The first time I saw you, Carrie, was like a long, long time ago. You gave a talk on the Prairie Coteau, the
Oh,
hydrology of the
yeah. You
Prairie
must have been.
Coteau.
Are you Native Plant Society too? Okay, you got to get to your things.
Yeah, I know. It was just I like blown away. Whoa, this woman knows so much. So, Mary Ellen, you going to talk about
Well,
email?
yes. Carrie, that was wonderful. I have a lot more questions because we didn't even get into aquifers and data centers because that's a concern I have when they find out how limited the groundwater is. I'm worried that they're going to go after our deeper aquifers. But as Gretchen said, as a reminder, we do record these webinars. They are available on our website. She'll put them in our newsletter. You can watch them on YouTube. But I really encourage our local leagues to use these as part of your programming season. I'd love to see every local league once a year do something about issues surrounding water quality and water quantity in the Upper Mississippi River region and help us spread the word. We also have our upcoming annual meeting, June 3rd. It'll be by Zoom. The business meeting is at 6, and every local league will select a delegate, a voting delegate, but everyone's welcome to attend. But following that at 7 o'clock, we have a program. And again, Minnesota's to the fore. Gretchen's going to put the information in the Q&A since you cannot see the chat. But this author, I'm going to see if I can focus this. On my screen, it's not very focused, but it doesn't want to focus, does it? Anyway, Dodge County, Inc., Big Ag and the Undoing of Rural America by Sonia Trom Ayers. An absolutely fascinating and depressing story of how these big hog confinements come into counties and absolutely just destroy the environment. This was even more upsetting to me because I certainly didn't see much of Minnesota nice in this story about how these big corporations just overwhelmed county government and landowners. So that's going to be June 3rd, 7 o'clock by Zoom. You can register again on our website. Gretchen will have it out in the newsletter. And okay, I see Carrie would like to answer this question. Carrie, are you still on? I think you answered that one.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to type the information for the Darcy lecture into anything except into the Q&A. So I
Yeah,
pasted
and
the information there.
I'm not sure people can see the Q&A, so I will put Carrie's answer and other things into the email. So I'm going to do is follow-up email, and I'll stick all that in there. So that should be the answers everybody needs.
And Carrie, I'd also like for Gretchen to share that upcoming talk you mentioned at the University of Minnesota.
That's what I just was trying to share. Yeah.
Is that Zoom available, or is it just I looked at it.
They want people to be in person for that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Okay,
not so
no
helpful.
Zoom. Okay,
Yeah.
so not available. So again, Carrie, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We
Yeah.
will always have more questions. We'll probably bring you back at another time. This is of interest to all of us in this region. And Gretchen, thank you for your tech support. And again, to all of the people on, just as a reminder of our annual meeting, everyone's welcome to attend. Also, we're always looking for people who are interested in our niche topics to join our action committee. The action committee is the one that really focuses mostly on policy and legislation. And you can explore what they're looking at again on the website. And if you come to our annual meeting, you'll be hearing more about the work we've been doing this last year. Thank you all for joining us and hope to see you in June. Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you. I am going to turn off the recording. Ta-da.